Hannah Whitcomb stepped off the Greyhound into a parking lot, the size of a football field, and the cold hit her first. Sharper than anything she'd felt back in Hamilton, a dry Alberta cold that seemed to come up through the soles of her boots. She had one suitcase. She had a folder of papers her lawyer had mailed her 3 weeks ago, and she had a name written on a sticky note in her coat pocket. Caldwell. Theo Caldwell. The man she'd married, technically, 4 days earlier, in a courthouse 2 provinces away, without him present, with a notary and a video call and a signature that still felt like it belonged to someone else. She scanned the lot. A man stood by a faded gray truck, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, not waving, not smiling, just watching her the way you'd watch weather move in. He was taller than she'd pictured from the one photo his sister had sent. Broader through the shoulders, a few days of stubble, a baseball cap instead of the hat she'd half expected from a man who ran cattle for a living. When their eyes met across the lot, something in his face shifted, just slightly, like a man recalculating. She walked toward him because someone had to. Mr. Caldwell. She held out her hand because that was what you did, even when the man was your husband. Theo's fine. He didn't take her hand right away. He was still looking at her like she'd arrived in the wrong skin. You're not what I expected. Is that a problem? No. He said it too fast, then seemed annoyed with himself for saying it too fast. He took her suitcase before she could argue, hefting it like it weighed more than it should, which it did, because she'd packed every photograph she owned, and 3 of her late mother's sweaters that didn't fit in any sensible way into her new life. Trucks this way. She'd seen his ranch profile through her cousin Priya, who ran a small online network for people in exactly Hannah's position, women who needed a fast, legal, defensible reason to disappear from one province into the custody jurisdiction of another, and men who needed help they couldn't afford to hire and couldn't trust to strangers. It wasn't supposed to be romantic, it was supposed to be paperwork. A marriage on record, 6 months minimum, enough to satisfy a judge that Hannah Whitcomb had stability. An address, a husband, a reason her ex-fiancé's lawyer couldn't paint her as a flight risk with no fixed residence when the custody hearing for her niece came up in the spring. Theo Caldwell needed a wife on paper for reasons of his own. Something about an inheritance clause his late father had written into the ranch's ownership structure. Something about needing to prove the property wasn't going to revert to a cousin in Saskatoon who'd never once mucked out a stall. Whatever it was supposed to be simple, practical. A business arrangement between 2 people who would barely have to speak. He hadn't told her she'd be pretty. She hadn't told him she'd be carrying this much weight behind her eyes. The drive out to the ranch took 40 minutes on a highway that turned to gravel, turned to a single rutted lane, fields the color of old wheat stretching out under a sky that seemed to go on without apology. Hannah kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the land go by and didn't ask questions, because questions felt like an invitation to be asked questions back. And she wasn't ready for that yet. You'll have the room at the end of the hall, Theo said finally, as the house came into view, a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on one end. It's got its own lock. I'm not. He stopped. Tried again. I'm not expecting anything from you. This is a business deal. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours. In 6 months we file the paperwork, and you go wherever you need to go. That works for me, Hannah said, and meant it, and didn't look at him. Because there was something in the careful way he'd said, I'm not expecting anything from you, that suggested he'd had to practice the sentence on the drive to the bus station. The house, when she stepped inside, told her more about Theo Caldwell than he probably wanted told. It was clean in the way a man keeps a house clean when he's trying to prove something to himself. Dishes done, floor swept, but no photographs on the walls except one, faded, of a woman with Theo's same stubborn jaw, hung crooked above the mantel like nobody had touched it in years. My mom, he said, when he caught her looking. She passed when I was 22. Dad followed her 4 years back. It's just been me and the cattle since. I'm sorry, don't be, wasn't your doing. He set her suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. Kitchen stocked. I work sunup to sundown most days. Calving season's coming, so you'll mostly have the place to yourself. There's a truck out back you can use if you need to get to town. Anything else you can ask, but I'd rather you didn't need to. It was, Hannah thought, the least romantic welcome she'd ever received, and somehow it was exactly what she needed. Nobody asking her to perform gratitude. Nobody expecting her to be charming. Just a room with a lock and a man who wanted to be left alone as badly as she did. She didn't tell him, that first week, why she really needed the marriage. She let him believe what the paperwork implied: divorce, custody complications, a standard story. She didn't tell him about Marcus, about the 18 months she'd spent learning the specific cruelty of a man who never raised his voice, never left a mark anyone else could see, who'd convinced half her own family that she was the unstable one, the dramatic one, the one who couldn't be trusted with her sister's daughter after her sister died. And there was nobody else, nobody but Hannah and a custody court that didn't know yet which version of her to believe. What she did tell him on the third night, when she found herself in the kitchen at 11 o'clock unable to sleep and found him there too, nursing a coffee he clearly wasn't going to finish, was smaller and truer than the whole story. "I'm not running from a bad divorce," she said. "I'm running from someone who isn't supposed to know where I am." Theo didn't ask follow-up questions. He just looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that weighed things and set them down carefully instead of dropping them. "Then nobody's going to know you're here. Not from me. You don't know what you're agreeing to. I know enough." He turned his mug slowly on the table. "There's not a soul within 40 miles of this place who'd give a stranger directions to my front door. I made sure of that a long time ago, for reasons that aren't mine to tell you yet either. So you keep your business, I'll keep mine, and this house stays exactly as private as you need it to be." It was the first time Hannah let herself believe, just slightly, that the bus had brought her somewhere safe. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that surprised her with how much she came to need it. Up before the sun because the cattle didn't care about her sleep schedule, coffee made by whichever of them woke first, the long quiet stretches of the day when Theo was out in the fields and Hannah taught herself, badly at first, how to manage a kitchen meant for a family of more than one, how to patch a hole in a barn wall, how to recognize the specific sound a sick calf made before Theo even came in from checking the herd. She started keeping the books for him, almost by accident. She'd been an accountant in her old life, the life with Marcus, and one evening she found Theo squinting at a column of numbers with the particular frustration of a man who was good at everything except paperwork, and she just reached over and took the ledger from him. "You're missing a decimal point here, and here." She flipped 2 pages back. "This whole quarter's off by about $4,000. He stared at her. "You're an accountant, was." She corrected the figures without looking up. Before what? Before everything got complicated. He let it go, the way he always let things go when she didn't want to push further. And from then on the books became hers, quietly, without either of them naming it as anything more than practical. It was the first thing she'd been good at in a long time that nobody had taken credit for, twisted, or used against her. The trouble started in week 6, the way trouble always starts, small, easy to dismiss, until it wasn't. A truck Hannah didn't recognize idled at the end of the long gravel drive for 10 minutes one afternoon before pulling away. She told herself it was lost. The next week, a man at the grocery store in the nearest town, 50 minutes out, asked the cashier, loudly enough that Hannah, 2 aisles over, heard every word, whether anyone in the area had seen a woman matching a description that fit Hannah down to the color of her coat. The cashier said no. Hannah left without her groceries and didn't tell Theo for 2 days. When she finally did, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the lights off because somehow the dark felt safer, he didn't react the way she expected. He didn't panic, didn't lecture her for not telling him sooner, didn't ask why a man would come this far looking for an accountant from Hamilton. "Marcus," Theo said. "Not a question. How did you? You say his name in your sleep sometimes, not often. But enough." He said it gently, like he'd been holding the knowledge carefully for weeks, waiting for the right moment to set it down between them instead of springing it on her. "I figured it wasn't my business until you made it my business. Seems like it just got made my business." Hannah's hands were shaking, and she hated that they were shaking. Hated that even 400 kilometers and a marriage certificate hadn't been enough to keep that particular tremor out of her body. "He doesn't hit. He never hit. That's the thing nobody believes. They want bruises, they want a reason, and all I have is 2 years of feeling like I was disappearing a little more every single day, and a niece I'm not allowed near because he told my whole family I was the unstable one." "I believe you," Theo said. And the simplicity of it nearly broke her, because nobody had said it to her like that, without a single qualifier, in longer than she could remember. "You don't know me well enough to believe me. I know you balance a quarter's books in an evening for fun. I know you pulled a calf out of a breech position in February with your bare hands because I was laid up with a fever and you'd read about it in a manual the night before. I know you've never once asked me for anything you didn't pay back twice over in work." He stood, came around the table, and for the first time in 6 weeks, reached out and took her hand. Not the formal handshake from the parking lot, something else entirely. "I know enough." She let him hold her hand. She let herself, for one reckless minute, lean into the idea that this arrangement, this strange practical marriage between two people running from different ghosts, might be turning into something neither of them had bargained for. He installed cameras at the end of the drive the next morning. He called a contact of his, a retired RCMP officer named Forsyth, who'd known Theo's father, and now ran a small private security consultancy out of Lethbridge. And within 3 days there was a man parked discreetly down the road in an unmarked truck, watching, while Theo went about pretending nothing had changed. Because the worst thing they could do, Forsyth said, was let whoever was looking know they knew they were being watched. It was Forsyth who found the connection a week later. Marcus hadn't come himself. Of course he hadn't. Men like Marcus never did their own watching, but he'd hired someone, a man with a record for harassment and a habit of working for clients who couldn't be found doing the harassing themselves. The man's name was on a rental agreement for a cabin 20 minutes from the Caldwell Ranch, paid for in cash, booked for an open-ended stay. "He's not here to talk to you," Forsyth told them both, at the kitchen table, laying out photographs Hannah made herself look at, even though every part of her wanted to flinch away. "Men like this, hired this quiet, this patient, he's building a case. Pictures of you here, pictures of the two of you together, anything that makes the custody argument easier. Maybe worse than that. We don't know yet, and I'd rather find out before he does something instead of after." Theo's jaw was tight enough that Hannah could see the muscle working in his cheek. "What do you need from us, Time? And for the two of you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Normal days, normal routine, while we close in on him properly. He runs the second he thinks you're onto him." It was the hardest 2 weeks of Hannah's life, harder even than the 18 months with Marcus, because now there was something to lose that mattered more than her own safety. Theo, standing between her and a danger he hadn't signed up for, and a ranch full of people, hired hands and a retired cop and a grocery clerk who'd started walking her to her truck without being asked, all of them quietly closing ranks around a woman they'd known for 6 weeks. The night it broke came in late March, with the calving barn lit up against a black sky, and Theo elbow-deep, helping a heifer through a difficult berth, and Hannah standing watch by the barn door because that was their system now, someone always watching the dark. She saw the headlights first, not on the road, but cutting across the field from the cabin's direction, no lights on the vehicle itself, just the faint shape of a truck moving slow and deliberate toward the house. She didn't scream. She'd learned in 18 months with Marcus the particular danger of giving a man advance warning of your fear. She walked, calm and fast, into the barn. "Someone's coming," she said low, cutting across the south field. No headlights. Theo's hands stilled on the heifer for half a second, then kept moving, finishing what he'd started, because an animal in distress didn't care about the danger approaching from the field. "Call Forsyth. Numbers on the fridge. Then get to the house and lock the door behind you. Do not wait for me, Theo. I mean it, Hannah." It was the first time he'd used her first name with that particular weight in his voice, and something about hearing it cut through every argument she might have made. Go. She went, but she didn't lock herself away the way he asked. She called Forsyth, her voice steadier than she'd believed it could be, and then she stood at the kitchen window with her grandmother's old cast-iron pan in one hand. Because if 18 months with Marcus had taught her anything, it was that she was done being someone who simply waited to find out what would happen to her. The truck stopped 50 yards from the house. A man got out, not large, not threatening to look at, which Hannah understood now was its own kind of danger, the kind that could stand in a grocery store aisle and ask questions without anyone thinking twice. He had a camera with a long lens slung around his neck, and for one terrible second Hannah understood that Forsyth had been right, that this was about evidence, about pictures, about building a story for a custody court 3 provinces away, that would paint her as a woman who'd run off and shacked up with a stranger within weeks of leaving her family. Headlights swept across the field then, Forsyth's truck, and behind it the slower flash of an actual RCMP cruiser, because a retired officer with the right connections could make calls that moved faster than Hannah would have believed possible. The man with the camera ran for his truck, made it perhaps 30 feet before the cruiser cut him off at the end of the drive. Theo came across the yard at a dead run, the heifer and her new calf forgotten for the moment, and didn't stop until he had Hannah's face in his hands, checking her over with the kind of frantic thoroughness of a man who'd spent the longest 5 minutes of his life imagining the worst. "I'm fine," she said, and found she was laughing, a little wild, a little disbelieving. "I'm fine, Theo. You're holding a frying pan. I was prepared to use it." Something in his face cracked open then, relief, and underneath it something that had been building for weeks that neither of them had named out loud. "I thought I told you to lock yourself in." "You did." She set the pan down on the porch rail. "I've spent 2 years doing what I was told to keep myself safe. I'm done with that version of safe." He didn't say anything to that. He just pulled her in, careful of the cold night air, and the fact that they were standing in full view of an RCMP officer walking a handcuffed man toward a cruiser, and kissed her like a man who'd been waiting 6 weeks for permission he hadn't realized he needed. The man's name, it turned out, was a private investigator with a long history of exactly this kind of work. Surveillance for clients with money and grudges, careful enough to stay 1 legal step removed from his employers. He gave Marcus up within an hour of questioning, eager to trade information for a lighter charge, and the photographs on his camera, the ones meant to paint Hannah as unstable, instead became evidence of exactly the kind of campaign her lawyer needed to dismantle every claim Marcus had built against her. The custody hearing, when it came in May, was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Hannah's niece, 6 years old and solemn in a way that broke Hannah's heart every time she saw it, came to live with her 2 weeks later, in the room down the hall from the one with the lock that Hannah had stopped using sometime back in March. Theo built a swing set in the yard without being asked, the same week the little girl arrived, working on it in the evenings after a full day with the herd, saying nothing about it, just doing it the way he did everything, quietly, completely, without needing thanks. It was June before either of them said the word out loud, sitting on the porch steps with the calving season finally behind them, and the fields gone green in a way Hannah hadn't believed Alberta could manage, back when she'd stepped off that bus into a cold she thought might never thaw. "I didn't marry you for this," Theo said, watching the little girl chase the dog across the yard, gold evening light catching everything. "I want you to know that. I married you because my father's will was a mess and I needed a wife on paper to keep the ranch in one piece. I never expected." He stopped, started again. "I never expected to fall in love with my own wife. I never expected to let myself," Hannah said. "I spent 2 years convinced that loving anyone again was the most dangerous thing I could do. And now?" She looked at him, at the stubborn jaw, the hands that had pulled calves and built swing sets, and held hers through the worst nights of her life, without once asking her to be smaller, quieter, easier than she was, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. "Now I think the danger was never love," she said. "It was just the wrong kind, with the wrong man, for far too long." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had that first night in the kitchen, except there was nothing careful or uncertain about it now. "Well," he said, with the particular dry warmth she'd come to recognize as the closest thing to a smile he gave away easily, "I suppose we'd better tell the lawyer this marriage isn't ending in 6 months after all, down in the yard." The little girl shrieked with laughter as the dog knocked her gently into the new grass, and the sound of it carried up to the porch, like the first real proof, after everything, that they had built something worth keeping.